becomes destiny, the normative response to biologized abnormality. And racial constructions not only oppress by normalizing inequality, they can also make the lie of race seem liberating, attractive, and romantic, as I said before. And I want to use the word sort of emotional truth here. And I want to use that knowing that it's a freighted term, because this is a term that comes from James Frey when he was uncovered, when he wrote his book, A Million Little Pieces, and then it was uncovered that he actually had lied about his drug-addled, violent history, and that in fact he was warm and fuzzy and middle class. But he said that it was, in fact, that it contained emotional truth for what he was going through, and therefore it was very helpful to people who were addicts and so forth, and that therefore, please accept it for his emotional truth. And that's when Oprah, called him out on the carpet, and it was ever so exciting. But meanwhile, at the same time this was happening, I began to really think about that term, because it does seem to me that some of our most cohering social rites and rituals have something like emotional truth at their base, and that's what makes the question of race so complicated or hard to simply exercise our moral freedom to exceed. And so let me give you the thought process that ties that to James Frey, because this was during the Frey controversy occurred at the same time that, again, Skip Gates was hosting his series exploring his roots and those of a handful of other prominent African Americans. If you recall, it was on PBS, and it included Chris Rock and Oprah Winfrey herself, Whoopi Goldberg, Sarah Lawrence Lightfoot. And it was a fascinating series of TV programs, particularly from the perspective of the discipline of history, because it revealed the peculiar difficulties of tracking lines of descent through slavery, because the sales of human beings acknowledged no family ties. Chattel slavery was not about family, it was about individual packages of product. And the absence of last names, the absence even of first names in some cases, and the necessity for consulting not just census records, but also the master's so-called property holdings for listings of possible relatives. And the reconstruction of family history was like an archaeological dig, part intergenerational storytelling, part study of migratory patterns, part recovery of commercial transactions, as well as part science. Now, of course, the science du jour was DNA tracking. And on the one hand, DNA testing can be quite useful, obviously, in establishing certain kinds of family relationship. And Gates's own test results showed that he had no relation to Samuel Brady, who was the white patriarch he had grown up knowing, so-called, as the man who had impregnated his great-great-grandmother. That was the family narrative that he carried forward to the future, and that everybody expected, sort of like Jefferson and Sally Hemings, to be confirmed by this testing. And in this program, nothing had prepared him for Brady's not being his direct ancestor, which, if I understand the results, was what it showed, that he was not related to this person. And he was gobsmacked by it. And indeed, one of Gates's cousins remained adamant that the test had to be wrong, that the science had to be wrong, something had to be wrong. And if the test were right, he said, there would have to be two truths. One would be the story he grew up with, the other what the DNA said. And I was intrigued by that notion of two truths. Somewhere in between what the DNA says and what shaped the family account is a gap that is something like a lie. I mean, we could just say somebody in their history lied. Perhaps a secret passing from black to white, an act of assimilation, an act of aspiration, a myth to hide some shame or some rape, a change of identity to escape to freedom. And yet, I do hesitate to think of it as precisely on the same moral level as the kind of lie that was so condemned in the case of James Frey, or in the kind of lie that leads to extortion or outright fraud. There is something very human, I think, about the repetition of family stories until they become epic rather than literal, the burying of family secrets, the lying of ancestors, the reinventions of migrants, the accommodations of raw ambition, the insulations from terrible shame. And there's also something deeply American that links all of that to our mobility as Americans. And that one of the things that is going to be most intriguing is how DNA reinvests in not just our society, but in global society, a permanent sense of status, of who we are. We are fixed in time. We are fixed in terms of predictive capacities based on disease probability, intelligence, and so forth. You've probably read in the New York Times recently that there's a camp in China for tracking children over the course of their lives to see if they can relate DNA to their probabilistic lifetime chances. And so the, and I think that all of this is, these kinds of family mysteries are part of how many, many of our ancestors, regardless of where they came from, reinvented themselves in the new world. And if there is value to this kind of emotional truth, again, if I can be permitted that term, it is important not to confuse it with the kind of truth that DNA tells us. So while DNA can undoubtedly pinpoint certain aspects of our ancestry through sequencing, matching mitochondrial DNA, it does not make literal sense to say that, for example, and actually Gates obviously used this as a trope, not in a literal sense. He said to Oprah Winfrey, "You've got education in your genes." But we have, and I say that only to say that, even, those of us who know exactly what's in our genes or what it cannot be shown by one's genes, that it is nevertheless so much part of our casual conversation to say that, oh, you've got it in your genes. That there's this other significance with which we employ this vocabulary. That the metaphor is at least as powerful as the science. That metaphoric dimension is applied very carelessly, and I think that carelessness and even the attractiveness of it is what is so dangerous. And we have a long history of thinking of identity as genetically based. But again, there is no more an allele for being white or Latina than there is for education. There are malleable political designations that expand and contract with time and human circumstances that have palpable outcomes in the real world. But it behooves us to be less romantic, because again, I think we can all say that we don't want or we don't like the notion of eugenics as practiced by Hitler or the Cartwright conglomerate. But there is a romance about what the DNA swabbing shows us that is not just in this DNA forensic criminal world, but in the 23andMe notion that we can know ourselves more intimately on an individual level, or that we can connect more fruitfully, like sort of the craving to go back to Africa or to discover, as Oprah thought she was at one point, a Zulu princess, or to connect with our Yiddishkeit, or to feel like new doors have been opened if we have an Asian ancestor. Suddenly, I actually had a student who said, whose family had adopted a young Chinese girl baby, and was just really excited about what she was going to do with the violin when she came of age. And I think that the craving, the connection, the newness of these doors is in our heads. It's not in our mitochondria. It is a process of superimposing the identities with which we were raised upon the culturally embedded, socially constructed imaginings of the other. And again, that connection of ourselves, the me, to the pluralism of we, of the other, of what we could be. And the fabulous nature, and as in fable, the epic nature of what is imagined can be liberating and invigorating, but it is, again, fable. And if we read that story into the eternity of our bloodlines, if we biologize that history, then we'll be forever less than what we could be. Thank you.